Hi, I'm Brent Leggs with the National Trust for Historic Preservation's African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild, interviewing the sons, daughters, grandsons, and granddaughters of mid-20th century architects has been one of the best parts of producing U.S. Modernist Radio. We've had the pleasure of talking to Hick Stone, son of Edward Durrell Stone, John Barnes, son of Edward Larrabee Barnes, Ainsley Goris Gilligan, daughter of Landis, Fred Noyes, son of Elliot, Eric and Susan Saarinen, children of Arrow, Raymond and Dion Neutra, children of Richard, Francesca Breuer, daughter of Marcel, Mira Nakashima, daughter of George, Miles Jaffe, son of Norman, the grandchildren of Frank Lloyd Wright and Charles and Ray Eames, and the children of Craig Elwood, Charles Gwathmey, Charles Deaton, and many, many more. And while most architects' children do not become architects, modernism is always in their DNA. Joining us today are Elaine Dart Hanan, daughter of Chicago architect Edward Dart, filmmaker Nathaniel Kahn, son of architect Louis Kahn, and special musical guest Lori Lieberman. And now, your host, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. Don McLean's iconic ballad American Pie reached number 1 on the Billboard charts in 1972. And it's his most successful single. But it was another song from that same album that inspired another singer. Now, if you're good at music trivia, you're thinking, okay, I've heard this. That was Roberta Flack, who recorded Killing Me Softly with his song about Don McLean in 1973, taking that song to number 1. The story goes that Roberta heard Don singing a song from the American Pie album, a song called Empty Chairs, and was filled with incredible emotion. So much, in fact, that she wrote Killing Me Softly. As it turns out, that person was not Roberta Flack, who recorded it later. The OG was Lori Lieberman, and today, 50 years later, she's still killing me softly with her own version of Empty Chairs. As George Takei likes to say, oh my. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Elaine Dart Hanan is the daughter of Chicago area architect Edward Dart, who shaped the town with more than 100 houses and commercial buildings, most notably Water Tower Place, the Norris University Center, and the Pick Stager Concert Hall at Northwestern University. In 1975, when Elaine was still in her 20s, her father passed away during the prime of his career. He and Elaine's mother, Wilma, are interred at St. Michael's in Barrington, Illinois, a church that Dart designed and attended. You can see all of his houses at usmodernist.org/Dart. Here's George's conversation with Elaine Dart Hanan.
Elaine, thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Let's start with your family home, the home that you grew up in, that your dad designed. What was that like?
Well, we actually had 3 houses that he designed. Each time he wanted to experiment with something, he would experiment on us. So our first home, these were all in the country outside Barrington, beautiful rolling countryside, fields around us. And the first house was really wonderful. And I think it was actually my mother's favorite house of all 3.
What year was that?
Had to have been 50, maybe 51, 52. I was a little girl when we were in that house.
And what do you remember most about it?
I remember that it was in the middle of a very large field. It had a wonderful screen porch on one side with a garden in the middle of it. And I remember that it had an enormous deck on the back It was all glass, and you could look out at the fields and watch the deer run through and the cattle that would escape from local farms. It was very cozy. It had a big fireplace, little kitchen, dining room, several bedrooms. It was just a wonderful house to spend my first few years in.
And was this a modernist house?
It was. It was very modern. The very first house we lived in Barrington was a rental. It was actually an old farmhouse, a cottage on a farm. And it belonged to our dentist. Then he decided he bought some property. He wanted to design his own house. And so he did, really, right from the get-go. It was very simple. He actually made a lot of furniture for it. But it was a very happy time, and we loved the house. But before you knew it, he was on to something else. He always wanted to move on. So by the time I was around 8 years old, we moved to another house closer to town. He wanted to be closer to the train station because he had such a long commute. And the first house, we were pretty far out in the country, and it took about 15 minutes to get into town. And in the days when there weren't a lot of studded snow tires and gravel roads, it was tough to get there. So he wanted to be closer to his commute, and he bought another piece of property, and he built actually a very similar house, but the materials were a little different.
What was different?
In this house, he was in his limestone phase, and we had an enormous limestone fireplace. There were 2 stories attached. The living room was lower than the rest of the house. The bedrooms were up above on a sort of a winding curvature staircase. The floors were terrazzo.
Oh, wow. Nice.
There was a lanai with a garden and a little pool, reflecting pool within it. And it was also a screen porch. And then there was a kitchen family room, which was sort of unusual then, off of that lanai. And the dining room sat between the entry, the living room, and the kitchen. But it was all open. And the dining room overlooked our backyard, which was filled with oak trees. And it was absolutely lovely, except that I was allergic to oak pollen. So we all sneezed a lot. Daddy used to call it the green hill. We lived there for quite a long time. And when I was in high school, we moved to our third house, which was all open. There were very few trees on the property, but it was on a lake. And there were gorgeous willows surrounding a pond. You drove over a little old bridge to get to the house, which overlooked this beautiful lake. Barrington had a series of beautiful lakes, and we happened to live on one of them. There was an old barn foundation. So he built the house really on the structure of the old barn foundation. And it was very barn-like, very high ceilings, very unlike the other 2 houses. Lots of wooden beams, lots of beamwork. It had what he called the crow's nest in the very top, which was the peak of the roof. And there was a series of stairs. It was at a time he was doing a lot of churches. And so you entered underneath where the barn foundation began and walked up a series of stairs to a landing, and then another series of stairs where there was the house itself. And there was a bridge over these stairways that connected the living dining area to the bedroom area with the kitchen behind that. And that was a wonderful setting. It had a big, big front porch, and we'd sit there often in the summer when the weather was good and chat about life.
Was this the house that got such notoriety in House and Garden and Architectural Record?
Yes, I think so. It was built in 66. Actually, all the houses were in magazines, but this one, I think, got more notoriety than the others. He was well known at that point, or becoming so. And he was just about to join. He was on his own all these years and was just about to join Lobel, Schlossman and Bennett in Chicago as a partner. So it became Lobel, Schlossman, Bennett and Dart, a mouthful.
Yes, like a law firm.
It was. It sounded like a law firm. And I actually worked as a receptionist one summer And I would say it in my sleep. I literally would answer the phone, speak to my friends, and I'd start saying, Lobel, Schlossman, Bennett, and Dart. And I'd have to catch myself. I said it so often. But it was only for the summer, and it was great. And it was wonderful, actually, to be in his office as a young college student. I think I was a freshman or sophomore in college, to see him in action in his offices with his people and how he worked. And then after I got a design degree, I actually, once Water Tower Place was finished, I actually worked in his office very briefly then after he had died.
How did growing up as the daughter of an architect affect your career choices?
Well, I'm an interior designer, and so that definitely affected my career choices. And I don't think that I ever thought that I would be anything but that. We have moved many, many times in our married life. And so to get a full practice going was difficult. And we also had 3 children. But I've always worked in design.
I've asked a number of children of architects what it was like to have dinner with your parents. What was home life like with having a famous architect dad?
I mean, for me, it felt very normal because it's all I knew. You know, beside being an architect and driven and working a great deal, he would really let loose and relax and have a good time. And he was very funny and very entertaining and very warm, extremely energetic. It was always interesting. And he and Mom always had interesting things to talk about. He wouldn't talk about his day that much. We would talk about art, and we would talk about life and what happened at school and what the day was like. And he would discuss his architecture. I certainly was very aware of what was going on always, because he had a studio at home and he would work on weekends as well. He would always get up early in the morning on weekends and head down to his studio and finish up some things. But he was very efficient and very fast in his design approach. He had it all in his head, and he was gifted in that way, that he could get it all out on paper directly from his head. And so there weren't a lot of reworks, but we had a lot of fun and a lot of laughs. I mean, my memory as a child with both my mother and father was pretty idyllic. I knew that he was struggling to make it. We didn't have a lot of money. He was driven and worked a lot, worked very, very hard. He wanted to be the best he could be. So that really was the focus of the family. And Mother, every time he decided he would change houses, she had usually just finished the gardens by that point. And up, she'd have to go and start new gardens. And she was an incredible landscaper and loved to garden. And I also have inherited that. I love flowers and the garden and birds and all of those things. And they really worked very well hand in hand. And although she came from a much more traditional background, she embraced his architecture and loved it, loved living in his houses. They were very warm.
Your mother, Wilma, was Dutch,
yes,
and graduated from Duke. Tell me about her early days.
After graduating from Duke, it was the war, and she was actually engaged to a fellow from Duke in the engineering school, and they were going to get married, but the war came, and she actually had applied to Columbia to get a master's in social work. And once the war arrived and she knew that she would have to work, she learned to type better and went to work as a secretary while her future fiance was at war. What was his name? Sennhauser, Bill Sennhauser was his name. But during the war and during basic training, he wanted to be a flyer. And my dad was also a Marine flyer. And they met at Pensacola and they became best friends. Dad remembers meeting my mother when she came to Pensacola to visit Bill. And he remembered that she had on a yellow dress, and he saw her get off the train. And he said, I want to marry somebody like that someday.
Wow.
It was pretty prophetic. So Dad and Bill, they ended up being bomber pilots in the Second World War and went off to the Pacific. And Bill was unfortunately killed. A plane was landing and crash landed into his plane as it was about to take off. Mom was bereft, and Dad, being his best friend, was the one to take all of his belongings back to the family. And so he flew back to the States and went to the memorial service and saw my mother again. They began writing, and one thing led to another, and they became engaged and ultimately married after the war.
That is really a beautiful love story.
It really is. He would say, your mother walked off that train in that yellow dress. And I just went, wow, that Bill is so lucky. I would like to find something like that someday. And he did.
You have another interesting member of your family, your Aunt Susan.
Oh, Aunt Susan.
Who wrote a book.
Yes.
On your father. Tell me about Susan.
Susan was a wonderful character. Had a lot of the same energy as Dad did. Dad used to call her the blonde bomb because she would just race around and was very passionate, had an explosive personality, would laugh, had a lot of fun. She was Dad's older sister. She adored him, but she also wanted to kind of toot her own horn a lot of times. They were very competitive in that way. But she was a wonderful aunt, and we spent a lot of time with she and her husband, Uncle Jack. They lived in Lake Forest, not too far from us. And they actually had Dad to sign a house for them at one point. They also lived in a dirt house. I think he enjoyed egging her on a bit. He was a younger brother, and he liked to poke a little bit. Poke the bear. I think that's reflected a little bit in her book.
Well, the book is a really lively profile of your dad. It's not your usual kind of boring, dreary, too many detail book about an architect's work. It tells the story of your family, and it's really entertaining.
It is very entertaining and a good read. I think she was overly critical of him at times in the book. And had I been a little bit older when it was published, I think I would have asked her to take some of that out.
Yeah.
I think it was really inappropriate.
Maybe she was getting back at him a little bit for the taunting.
I do believe it hurt his legacy somewhat because it's the only piece of literature about him. You know, she frowned upon his liveliness and his fun that he had with friends. She was kind of a stick in the mud that way. And he would poke her. He definitely would poke her. They had a rivalry. They were all characters. All of Dad's family were characters. The book was in large part about her.
I can tell that.
She had a huge ego, and she was a writer, and she was well known. She was very controversial in the town in which she lived. She was saving old growth trees before anyone else was, and carrying placards about this or that or the other thing. And so a lot of people in Lake Forest did not like her. And she wasn't afraid, nor was Dad. They had incredible backbones and bluster and nerve. So they were very, very much alike. And I do think that caused friction. They were quite close in age. And he was always the little adored little brother in the family. And I think that made her upset. But she was a pistol, and she was very kind to us.
That beautiful woman in the yellow dress outlived your dad by about 40 years. I understand she passed away recently.
She passed away in 2018. She was 97 years old. It actually was a day after her 97th birthday. She was stoic. She'd had a lot of loss in her family. 2 brothers and a sister.
Her fiance.
And then her fiance. She had me, and then she lost 2 children, full term. And 10 years down the road, they adopted my brother. And then she lost my dad.
In 1975.
They were both 53 when he died. And it was very sudden, overnight, an aneurysm. And it was an enormous hole in all of our lives.
I bet so, because he was such a lively person.
He enjoyed every day of his life, even the disagreeable ones. He said at one point that he loved history, and he especially loved the history of war. He said one time that if he hadn't been an architect, he really thought that he would like to have been a history professor. And he dragged us to every Civil War battleground. And he had so many interests, and he explored every single one of them.
Elaine, looking back on your dad's career, what are some of your favorite buildings or houses that he did?
There are several favorites, but I loved our first house very, very much on Spring Creek Road.
Is it still there? Is it still standing?
I'm not sure. I think it may be. I liked the second house he built, and I loved the third house he built. There were other people's houses that I loved. The Orb House was wonderful. That was in Barrington. And in terms of his churches, which I think he was superb as a designer, St. Procopius Abbey by far stands out.
Where's that?
That is in Lisle, Illinois. He won many, many awards for that. At the time, he actually lived with the monks to decide how they lived, because it was indeed a monastery. It was their residence as well as the main church. The interiors are exquisite, and you can just feel the spirit of God and Christ when you're in there. And the other church I loved was his Greek Orthodox church.
And where is that?
It's outside of Chicago as well. I'm going to have to get you this book, George, with all of his works in it. One year, he and Mother went to Italy, and he came back, and he was so positive about himself. He had seen Michelangelo's works, and he decided he was going to sculpt a statue of St. Michael for the Episcopal Church of the same name in Barrington.
Where he's buried, right?
That is where his ashes are, and my mother's as well.
Yes.
One day, I was about 9 or 10, and we were in our second house, and this ginormous piece of limestone arrived and was deposited in the garage. And over a period of time, by God, the nose came forward, the face was there, the hair, there was a tip of a wing, there was an elbow, maybe some toes, and the full foot. And then he stopped. And we said, "Why did you stop?" He said, "It takes too long. I can't do this." And he quit.
You can see more of Ned Dart's houses at usmodernist.org/Dart. Thanks for joining me, Elaine.
Thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed it very much.
That was George with Elaine Dart Hanan. Nathaniel Kahn is an Academy Award-winning filmmaker. Born in Philadelphia and a graduate of Yale.
Go Bulldogs!
Nathaniel is the son of architect Louis Kahn and landscape architect Harriet Pattison. You can see all the Louis Kahn houses at usmodernist.org/lkahn. Nathaniel is the creator and director of documentary films, including My Architect, about his father's life and legacy, and The Price of Everything, about the incredibly high prices of contemporary art. This year, that landmark film, My Architect, is 20 years old. George spoke with Nathaniel recently via Zoom.
Welcome, Nathaniel.
Thank you for having me.
Nathaniel, your film, My Architect, is the gold standard of architecture documentaries. Pretty much everybody that does one uses yours as the template of excellence. It's just incredible what that film has meant to people over the years.
That's wonderful to hear. It means a great deal to me. And, of course, I set out not to make a movie about architecture, mind you. Okay, so it's very much the journey of a child looking for his parent, wanting to understand his parent. So it's a journey movie. It's a quest movie. And the parent in question, my father, Louis Kahn, happens to have been an architect, but I'm a filmmaker. So no matter what he would have done in his life, given the circumstances of how I knew him and the fact that he wasn't married to my mother and didn't live with us and all these things, these questions that he left me with, dying when I was 11, and me becoming a filmmaker, no matter what he did, I have the feeling I would have made a film about my quest to know my father.
I remember back in the 70s when Star Wars was being made, They were talking about how Joseph Campbell's books on the hero's journey and quests were very inspirational to that. And you've really made the Star Wars of architecture films here.
Well, that's about the highest praise I've ever heard for the film, and that means a great deal to me. You're really taking me back to my childhood, and I remember when Star Wars came out. It was early summer, 1977, I think.
77, yeah.
And I remember where I was when I first heard about it. I was with a friend of mine and his parents. We were in the mountains of Pennsylvania, the Poconos, and we were on a fishing trip. And my father died in 74, so he'd been dead for 3 years and still very much a raw wound. Not that I thought about it all the time. We were going fishing, but we were sitting there and my friend's mother pulled out, I think it was Time magazine or something, and read this review of this movie called Star Wars. And I'm an amateur astronomy buff, and I've made some films about astronomy too since then. But the idea of this quest across the galaxy to, a rebel quest to take on the evil empire and to rescue the truths of the world and to make things right again. And this young kid on this quest who didn't know his father. And it was just, I couldn't believe that this movie had happened, because it was not, it really came out of nowhere. Now we have movies about superheroes and quests. Some of them are great and some of them sure aren't, but it's a little more commonplace now. But at that point, those were not the movies that we were seeing. We saw 2001, but that's a very different vision,
yes.
Which I love. Of course, I adore that movie too. But Star Wars just hit me like a ton of bricks. And when I saw this idea that this young guy, was kind of in a backwater and didn't know who his father was, and he's kind of going on this quest. I felt like him. In many ways, I hadn't really thought about it until you just mentioned this, but My Architect is sort of structured. It is structured as a quest. Many documentaries are structured more around a subject, and they take a subject and interview different people on the subject, and they put it together, and it's more informational. And that's not the film I wanted to make. I wanted to make a film that really, was a quest, and that unfolded. And the documentaries that I love, the films that I love, are ones that you don't know what's going to happen next. And I think one of the reasons that people love documentaries in general, and one of the things I think people find in My Architect that they like, is that things happen that you wouldn't expect. There are meetings with people who reveal things that you wouldn't expect. The journey takes turns that you can't anticipate. Suddenly I'm meeting somebody who intersected with my father on the day that he died in Penn Station, New York, who just sort of came out of nowhere. And I'm meeting him in the train station in LA, and we have this conversation in which he's recounting to me my father's death.
That was Stanley Tigerman.
Well, no, this isn't Stanley Tigerman. This is a guy named Richard Katz who's in the film. The film unfolds as a quest. So I think that the structure of it is, I love films like Star Wars. I love the films of Kurosawa. I love films that are great stories that take you on a journey. So I wanted to structure the film that way. And I found, as I began to make it, that it was unfolding in these series of scenes. So rather than interviews, the film is composed of scenes, of encounters with people and places. And at first I didn't know how I would structure it. I made the film with an incredible team of people. The editor, Sabina Kreinbuhl, and I started working together with the material. We actually started with the material that I had from the Salk Institute. And we started to cut it together. And we realized that the Salk sequence in the film, which has that sequence of me rollerblading on the Salk Plaza, that it kind of had its own sort of structural integrity. It was like a film within a film. It was a little story that had a beginning and a middle and end on its own. And at that point, we both realized this is a film that will be composed not of interviews, but of scenes. So they're encounters with people. And also the camera person I work with, Bob Richmond, who started with the Maisels brothers and is a celebrated camera person, his sensitivity to what is happening in an encounter with somebody, it far transcends the kind of banal idea of an interview. It very much is an encounter. And so things would happen when I would go to meet people for the first time. And by the way, just structurally, I don't do pre-interviews. I don't want to know what somebody is going to say. So when I encounter someone, say Philip Johnson or I.M. Pei or B.V. Doshi, all, by the way, people who have passed away since I made the film, but they're in the film, right? But when I go to see those people, I haven't spoken to them beforehand and said, this is what I want to talk about. Because then all you get is you get something warmed over. The first time somebody tells you something, the first time you have this person coming, here comes the son of Lou Kahn, asking me, tell me about my father. There's almost something embarrassing about asking that question, by the way. But okay, I went and I did it, right? So in doing that, the first things that come out of a person you're talking to, those are the really interesting things. And one has to learn how just to kind of encounter it and listen. So going with Bob Richmond, the cinematographer that I work with, he's a person who captures not just what is being said, but the emotions between the people. So he knew, for instance, when somebody would say something. For instance, Jack McAllister, who worked with my father on the Salk Institute. When Jack says, we're standing at the Salk Institute, and he says, oh, your father used to come and have Christmas with us. And here's the beautiful background of the Salk Institute and the Pacific out there. And we're encountering this building. We've talked about this building. But now the guy has said something that's really personal. And suddenly Bob Richmond, the great cinematographer, knows to slowly pan to me. Right. And here's the son hearing his father is having holidays with this other family.
Yeah, right.
Not with me. And so I didn't have to say, oh, gee, isn't that a shame? I wish he'd been with me. You see it on my face.
Yes.
It just happened spontaneously. So to be so lucky to work with people who were that good at what they do, that Bob knew exactly to pan to me. But those are the moments that you don't expect in the film. Moments like that, as opposed to facts about the guy who was my father.
Right. You've said about the film that the whole thing is a parenthetical phrase to the official obituary that left out many aspects of your father's life.
I don't know that I said that. My gosh, I hate to think of myself or my movie as a parenthetical to anything. But I would say that I was less than a parenthetical phrase. I wasn't even in the parenthesis.
Yeah.
I was left out entirely, as was my sister, Alexandra, as was my mother, Harriet Pattison, as was Alex's mother, Ann Ting, all of whom are in the film. And the only people mentioned, of course, are his wife, Esther Kahn, and his daughter, Sue Ann Kahn, who I'm very close to. So the three children of Louis Kahn, we forged our own family out of choice. Both of my half-sisters are in the film. But so we weren't mentioned in the obituary. And it's quite a wonderful thing because, the film begins with the obituary. As you recall, it begins with a scene with me going to the New York Public Library. And this happened very late. We sort of couldn't figure out how to begin the movie. And I said, I've never really looked at my father's obituary. Let's do a scene at the New York Public Library where we look at the microfilm. So it begins with this microfilm search for the obituary. I find the obituary, and that helps to establish sort of who Louis Kahn was in the official sense of who he was as an architect and an artist, but it also establishes what's missing, which is the much more expanded story of his family, his personal life. And it's not in a sense of sort of revealing secrets. We were in the shadows and not known to many people. But there's something else there too, which is that we live in a time, and our approach many times to people's lives is the billboard events. And we tend to think of people as, their accomplishments and their achievements, but life is so much more than that. My father was sort of thought of as this sort of hero of modernism, which he was. But he was so much more than that, much more complex. There are great things that are missing and there are darker things that are missing. All those things are there. So my hope is that the film also causes us to question, the official story. And we look behind things for what's really there. And one of the things that I've been enormously gratified by is that over the years is Paul Goldberger, who wrote the obituary, has talked about this and many times, and he's actually written about it, that he felt badly about not including the bigger story. But it wasn't done in obituaries at that time. It is much more now. And I completely understand that. And he was a very young writer, and he writes
You didn't want to embarrass the person that was passed away with information that wasn't public.
Exactly. And only later, of course, does one look back and say, well, but there's so much that's missing. Yeah. So, and Paul is such a marvelous writer and a good friend. We actually did a Q&A together. We re-released My Architect. This is the 20th anniversary of the film. We had a wonderful celebration of the 20-year anniversary. We restored the film, remastered it. It looks far more beautiful than it did when it first came out because we went back to original camera negative and camera sources. And I worked with a group in Switzerland that does magical things. So we restored the film and relaunched it at Film Forum. And Film Forum was where we premiered the film 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And it was a big success and sold out for several months. It was enormously exciting, I must say.
Yeah.
And Paul Goldberger and I, we did a Q&A together. And it was very beautiful, moving to hear him say, here it is 20 years later. And 50 years after my father's death, 50 years after he wrote that obituary. And now we're seeing a much bigger panorama of the story.
A whole new generation of people are picking up on your father's work and his story. One of the recent books about this is one that your mother wrote. It is an absolutely lovely book. It's called Our Days Are Like Full Years by Harriet Pattison. And there's a beautiful picture of your father and mother on the front. And it's full of love letters that they wrote to each other. And when we interviewed her some time back, she read some of those love letters on the podcast. It was just heartwarming. I just couldn't believe it. And she has left us now.
She has. She died last year and was with it to the last. And I was just looking at some photographs of her yesterday, a little video of her. She was still designing gardens at the very end. And I asked her about art. And I said, is art important to life? And she said, absolutely, it's essential. We can't live without art. And so to the very end, her great faith was that through art, we truly could. And I'm not saying this in a Pollyanna or pablum-like way. She meant it, that through art, we really can make the world better and make life better for all of us. Art is an essential instinct to being a human being. And I actually made a film about the art world called The Price of Everything that looks at the crazy art world that we're living in now. There is quite a number of artists in the film, and I celebrate them in the film because I've known artists all my life and love artists. And my mother was certainly one of them. And she had this one ambition that she really wanted to write a book before she was gone. And she said that her mother, my grandmother, had always said, sort of on her deathbed, she regretted that she hadn't written a book. I'm not sure what my grandmother's book would have been about, but she lived an interesting life too. Everyone does, right? All human beings have interesting lives one way or another. But my mother, I think actually the movie, My Architect, sort of spurred her on to write her book. And I tell you a little story of that. When we opened My Architect, the very first showing was at an incredible festival called New Directors, New Films, it's related to the New York Film Festival. It's a collaboration between the Museum of Modern Art and the Film Society of Lincoln Center. And they selected the film to show it. And the first showing was at Lincoln Center, Alice Tully Hall. And, it's a huge hall, incredible hall that they had gotten enough ticket sales that they felt they could fill it. And we did fill it to the rafters. It was incredible. I Am Pei was there. It was an amazing opening screening. And afterwards, there was a Q&A, and someone in the audience said, what does your mother think of this film? And I said, I have no idea. I haven't shown it to her, but she is in the audience. She's sitting right there. Stand up, Mom.
Yeah, hi, Mom.
So if you could picture it, about 1,000 people in that hall, maybe even a little more. And she stands up, and there's this kind of silence, and then people clapped for her.
Yeah.
And it was such an incredible moment for her. So I didn't know what she thought about the movie, but at that moment, she decided she liked it just fine.
Yes. Oh, yes.
However, afterwards, she said, I like the movie very much, but you didn't show enough how we worked together and how much we loved each other. And I said, that's your story to tell, Mom.
Right.
That's not mine. That's yours. So I think that she began to work on the book at that point. And the book, as you've mentioned, gathers the letters. She sent letters to him. I don't know where those letters are. They may still exist. I really don't know. I sure would love to see them. But these are the letters that he sent to her and to me.
Okay.
So those letters, it took her a long time to assemble them in order and to tell her story wrapped around them. So it's sort of it's a waltz, if you will, between the letters my father sent her and me. She used a few of the ones he sent me, but mostly the ones to her, and then her story. And the two things weave together into this dance that also tells the story of the most productive 15 years of my father's career. So it begins in 1959, actually begins in 53 when they first saw each other, but they didn't get together until 1959. And that period between 59 and his death in 74 is where he built almost all of the buildings that he's known for, with only a couple exceptions of the Trenton Bathhouse and the Yale Art Gallery. But all of the other buildings, the Richards Building, the Salk Building, the Kimball Art Museum, the capital of Bangladesh, the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, the First Unitarian Church in Rochester, the Erdman Hall at Bryn Mawr. So all those buildings were in that period. So you're getting his words talking about the struggle and the joy of working on these projects and traveling the world, giving lectures, and so many projects that weren't happening at the same time as the ones that did get built. So it's really the only portrait that exists. It is the only portrait that exists of him in his own words, not his lectures, which,
are different.
His lectures are fine. They're good, but he was working those things over. This is his direct experience. And one thing that I take from that book that's so inspiring is how much he struggled, how much he doubted himself. One thing I've discovered in meeting people in the arts and filmmakers is the better they are, the higher they are, on the ladder of success, the more uncertain they are.
Sure.
The people who are really certain about what they're doing, they interest me not at all. The ones that really are at the top of their field, they doubt themselves constantly. They have to, because if you're not pushing the absolute limits of what is possible for you, or what is possible in the medium, or what is possible for a human being, you're not really doing it.
Let's talk about one of your dad's projects.
Sure.
This is one that was not built during his lifetime, but did get built later on Roosevelt Island in New York City.
Yes.
So tell our listeners about the project.
Sure. Well, one of the things that I discovered in making the film was how many projects of my father's didn't get built. And we built a section in the film, which we called variously the Symphony of Disappointments and the Portfolio of Lost Dreams, and it was sort of flipping through quite a number of projects that my father had really, really cared about and poured sometimes years into, like the Mikveh Israel Synagogue project in Philadelphia and the Horva Synagogue project in Jerusalem, both projects that he desperately wanted to have built and kept working on. In the case of the Mikveh Israel Synagogue in Philadelphia, kept working on after he was fired. He couldn't believe that I can't build this thing. It's too good. I can't let this go. And he kept working on these projects. But one of them that happened right at the end of his life in 1973, he was awarded the commission to design a memorial to Franklin Delano Roosevelt on the southern tip of Roosevelt Island in New York City. I mean, about the most exciting site you could possibly imagine. It's right on the southern tip. It's got Queens on one side, Manhattan on the other. It's right in the middle of the East River. It's looking at the last piece of bedrock that you can see sticking up above the water before it all tips over into the Atlantic. I mean, it is a great site. And it's a kind of a triangular site. And he set to work on it in 73. And my mother was the landscape architect on the project. And she talks about that, of course, in her book, Our Days Are Like Full Years. One of the things I love most about the project is it truly is a balance, the design for it that was worked throughout 73 and right up to his death in March 1974. So just for about a year, he's working intensely on this project with my mother. And the design of it really is a perfect harmony, perfect union between architecture and landscape. And my mother was a landscape architect. So it is this kind of perfect melding of nature and the built environment. And I hope people will go see it. It has now been built. So taking us back to 74, he dies. New York is in a fiscal crisis. The project gets mothballed. A couple of times in the 80s, it's resurrected, and people say we really should build this. It didn't happen. Again, in the 90s, someone tried, didn't happen. Then along comes the movie. And the movie gets released in 2004. And suddenly, because we included it in this portfolio of Forgotten Dreams, people start talking about this. Wow, this amazing project. What's happened to this? And the movie helps to rekindle efforts to build the memorial. And thanks to the incredible, tireless efforts of Ambassador William Vanden Heuvel, who had never given up on the idea of building this thing, the project began again. And they brought in an incredibly energetic young architect, Gina Polera, who helped to find the plans and resurrect it and fire people up about this thing. And they built it. It's incredible. They raised $53 million. Some people, Alpha Wood Foundation, different foundations gave money to this because they realized how important it could be to have a memorial to Roosevelt in New York City, and also to build really the last great work of a modernist architect, Kahn. They build it. It gets opened in 2012, I believe it was. And it is an incredible place.
It really is. I've been there several times. Yeah.
Yes. So it gets built, and at the opening, which was so wonderful, I went with my mother. And for her to, and she talks about this in the book, but for her to be able to see all these years later, this place that she imagined with my father, and to be acknowledged, you see, because my mother had been really completely shunted aside and not talked about, disrespected for many, many years, and ignored. To be acknowledged as the landscape architect, which she was of the project at the time, was a really a very beautiful thing.
I understand that your sister Sue also has a new book out about your father called The Last Notebook.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about that.
She's published a very nice looking book. He had many notebooks. So this is a notebook that he used during the last year of his life.
Oh, cool.
I don't know that it's actually the last notebook, but anyway, it's a book that he used during the last year of his life.
Okay.
And it has some sketches of the Roosevelt Memorial in it, which are very nice. And she's done some commentary about that in the book. So it gives people, I think, a flavor for the way he used notebooks, the way he drew and thought. And, you know, nowadays, it's so commonplace just to use your iPhone and take a picture of something, and it becomes very disposable. We take pictures not very thoughtfully, let's put it that way, right? We're recording our life as much as we're living it. I think that's problematic, actually. But at that time, and still, people who draw really observe things and really think about things. And for an architect, drawing is like exploring structure, exploring ideas. So you see in the notebook, in the drawings that are in the notebook, you see him exploring ideas, exploring feelings. How is the memorial room at the end of Roosevelt Memorial? What does it feel like? So the drawings give you a little bit of a window into my father's feelings about his architecture. And also, of course, he would work out details when he was traveling. This was a guy who thought and dreamed and lived architecture. He had this phrase, which was, even when I get a haircut, I'm an architect.
Great.
And so that's sort of the sense that, you know, people who are really deeply involved in their work, they never let it go. So the notebook gives you a window into the kind of constant exploration that somebody who's really engaged in their work, what that's like.
Thanks so much for talking with me.
Thank you. It's been lovely to speak together.
Born in Los Angeles, singer-songwriter Lori Lieberman studied music in Switzerland, influenced by French singers and good old American rock and roll. That led to a recording contract and several albums in the early 70s with Capitol Records. One day at the age of 20, she was at a Don McLean concert and was inspired to write Killing Me Softly, which she wrote and recorded. Despite Roberta Flack later taking this song to number one, Laurie's two male co-writers took the money and denied her participation in the song. It was a decades-long dispute, with so much stress on Laurie that she retired for about 20 years. But with a comeback in 2009, Laurie has 16 albums over the years and remains a remarkably powerful and vibrant performer, one of the most highly regarded songwriters in the industry. Here's my conversation with Laurie Lieberman. Laurie, I don't know if it's a coincidence lately, but a lot of our guests have some connection with Switzerland, and you do too. What was it like growing up in Switzerland?
Oh my, I can't believe you have a lot of guests that have that connection.
Yeah.
For me, I was born in Los Angeles, and my father invented paint for the outside of houses that could be sprayed from a gun type of thing. And he wanted to make it international. He was a really smart 21-year-old when he started and when he invented this. And so when I was 8 years old, he basically closed his eyes and pointed to Europe and pointed to Geneva, Switzerland. And my two sisters, my mom and my father and I all moved there and lived there for the remainder of my childhood. My father wound up becoming a Swiss citizen, marrying a Swiss woman. And yeah, my connection is very deep there. And in fact, I'm going back in June for the first time. It's bittersweet because a lot of people have left.
Yes, sure. Did you start singing in Switzerland? Is that where it got to you?
It did. I was in a band called the Ultraviolet Blues.
Good name.
Yeah. And we did all kinds of heartfelt songs like by Alice Cooper and Julie Driscoll, Season of the Witch. But I started playing the guitar when I was 12. And I was the only one in my school that did play, and I'm left-handed, so I didn't understand how it works. So for the first couple of years, I was playing it backwards, and it was really hard. And now I understand why.
Sure, yeah. And you sang French songs, too.
I did. My influences back then were a singer named Françoise Hardy and France Gall and Johnny Hallyday and a lot of French singers. And then music from Germany and through Luxembourg radio became pretty popular in Geneva. And Dionne Warwick then became popular in my childhood. And after that, my sister went to college in Maine, Colby College.
Colby College, sure.
Right? Do you know it?
Uh-huh.
And when she came back to Geneva, she brought with her all these albums by Tom Rush and Joni Mitchell, Judy Collins. And I was totally then blown away by their music. And then I was able to play the guitar and sing some of the songs that I loved so much. And it changed my life.
And how did you get back to L.A.?
I graduated from my school in Switzerland, and because we had no SAT training, and honestly, school was not my strong point anyway. The only school I could get into was a small junior college in Boston. So I went there for a couple of years and then came out to Los Angeles where my grandparents were living. And I thought, oh, I'll try my hand at singing. I had done a lot of music work in college. And I don't know, I just thought maybe I could try my hand at it. And that's where it started. I was singing in a club and two guys came in and heard me and immediately wanted to sign me to a deal with Capitol Records. And that's how it started.
And then you went to this concert by Don McLean.
I did. So the first album was just about done when my girlfriend lured me out of my apartment and wanted me to see a singer that I'd never heard of, Don McLean. And
no one had heard of Don McLean then, really.
I mean, I don't think so. I really don't think that American Pie was a number one hit yet.
No,
I
think
was
before that.
His first album. It was before that, the Castles in the Air album. Mm-hmm. But anyway, as he was performing solo, I was sitting in the back and admiring his singing and playing. And then I was going through a really hard time as well, personally. And when he sang this particular song, Empty Chairs, I really felt like he was singing to me. And I wrote a poem on a napkin when the audience filtered out about going to a club and hearing a guy I've never heard of, and that he was reading from my diary, and that I had felt embarrassed, and that became Killing Me Softly.
It's amazing how listening to that album, you feel so intensely. The words just make your heart opens up when you listen to that. I remember feeling that when I first heard it, and I was just 10.
I hate you. George. That's not fair. Come on. Is everybody just 10? No, I know. It was a very pure time musically for him.
Mm-hmm.
And he just had something back then that was so special and resonated so deeply with a lot of people. But for me in particular, you never know, when a moment will become a defining moment. So for me, had I not gone to that club with my girlfriend, that song would never have been written. And, it's kind of a big thing.
We've had musical guests on the show that I've swooned over, but never one that I have melted to, and you are it.
Oh,
because what I want to play for our listeners is your version of this song that you heard with Don McLean, Empty Chairs.
I feel the trembling tingle of a sleepless night creep through my fingers, and the moon is bright. Beams of blue come flickering through my window pane, like gypsy moths that dance around a candle flame. And I wonder if you know that I never understood, that although you said you'd go until you did, I never thought you would. Moonlight used to bathe the contours of your face, while chestnut hair fell around the pillowcase. The fragrance of your flowers rest beneath my head, a sympathy bouquet left with a love that's dead. And I wonder if you know that I never understood, that although you said you'd go until you did, I never thought you would. Never thought the words you said were true. Never thought you said just what you meant. Never knew how much I needed you. Never thought you'd leave until you went. Morning comes and morning goes with no regret, and evening brings the memories I can't forget. Empty rooms that echo as I climb the stairs, and empty clothes that drape and fall on empty chairs. And I wonder if you know that I never understood, that although you said you'd go until you did, I I never thought you would. You would. Until you did, I never thought you would.
That's just incredible, Lori. I mean, now I want to write a song on a napkin and give it to somebody and have it become a number one hit.
I know. What were the odds?
I know. So how did Roberta Flack pick up this song and take it to number one from that point?
So my album came out and Capitol Records was pushing that particular song as a single. My version was a real, folk song. It wasn't anything that she had created, basically guitar-based and with some violins and with a backbeat. And I was featured on American Airlines. They had this thing called Fun in Flight. And, when you used to listen to, music, what they gave you.
Right. They would give you those headphones that were filled with air. The air would go through. There was no electronics. It would just shoot the sound waves through the tubes into your ears.
That's true. And I was on the cover of their Fun in Flight, and she was on a plane from, I think, New York to LA. And she, was listening to the playlist, and then, you couldn't just stop a song and go back. So she had to listen. It featured my entire first album. So she liked the title of it and then listened to the entire album and then had to listen again throughout the flight and make notes. And she just loved it. She felt she could do something with it. And by the time she landed, she called her producer, Joel Dorn, and she said she had found this song, and she performed it live in concert as an encore. And she tells the story that, at the end of her show, the audience was applauding, and she was telling her band, and Quincy Jones was there, and she was like, I don't know what to do. What should I do? Gosh, there's this song I've kind of been working on. Let me just see. And she sang Killing Me Softly for the first time. And the audience went crazy. And Quincy said to her, don't sing that dang song again until you record it. And so she did and made it number one. And it has continued on and on and on, thanks to her. And thanks to me for going to the club.
Yes. And thanks to you for going on a hilarious version of the Mike Douglas talk show, where you are talking about this song. And there's Tony Curtis right behind you, who you're ignoring completely.
No, I look at that video. I look at that. No, I was so, honestly, I was having a panic attack. I really was. If I look at my face closely, one side's not even moving. But I sang the song, which was okay. Then I walked towards the panel where Tony Curtis was. And without even looking at him, I just kind of handed him my guitar.
Here, take my coat.
Here, whoever you are. Oh God. And I was very, very anxious. And then he invited me back, and I was on the panel with Billie Jean King. And that was nice.
Yes.
Yeah, she was great.
That was back during the time where she took on the grudge match with Bobby Riggs, right?
No, before that.
Well, before that. We
were talking about how we suffered from panic attacks. And she said she was so nervous. Always, she felt like she was going to throw up before a match. And I said, I do too. So we bonded.
You took some time off from music, and then you bounced back into the scene, around 2009?
Let's see. 1979, I had my fifth album out. I had done 4 with Capitol Records and 1 with a small company that was distributed by RCA. And then the music business totally changed. I'm presently married to Joseph Calley, and I always blame him for the fact that music changed around that time because he is an actor. He does other things now, but he was in the iconic Saturday Night Fever. So disco hit then.
Disco hit.
Yes, and Joe was one of the core group of John Travolta's, friends in that movie. And so when disco came and I didn't really know where my music fit in, and I was kind of shamelessly sort of trying with shoulder pads and, trying to be something I really wasn't, I finally just packed it in and said, this isn't for me. And I then had some children with my first husband and really was out of it. I never thought I'd get back into it. And I was out of it for like 15 years and pretty happily, but I missed it and secretly writing and not showing my stuff to anyone. And it was Joe that got me back into the business. He remembered my early stuff and he got me back into recording. And in 94, I had an album. I became kind of the darling of the audiophile community and had a series of albums. And I've just now released and will be releasing my 21st album. So I've been doing it, right along Carnegie Hall and on tour, not as much as I was, but very happy.
Well, the albums you've been producing recently are incredibly well orchestrated, and that same kind of heartfelt spirit that we talked about earlier comes out in it.
Thank you.
This is a classic song of yours that you have interpreted, and it makes me want to get on a plane and travel there. Here's Lori with Moonlight in Vermont.
Pennies in a stream, the falling leaves of a sycamore, moonlight in Vermont, icy finger waves, ski trails on a mountainside, snowlight in Vermont, telegraph cables, they sing down the highway and travel each bend in the road. People who meet in this romantic setting are so hypnotized by the lovely evening summer breeze, the warbling of a meadowlark, moonlight in Vermont. Telegraph cables, how they sing down the highway and travel each bend in the road. People who meet in this romantic setting are so hypnotized by the lovely summer breeze, the warbling of a meadowlark, moonlight in Vermont, moonlight in Vermont.
Lori, again, that's beautiful. I am melting here. Not unlike the Wicked Witch and Dorothy in the pool, down onto the floor. Thank you. Thank you. You've got some concerts coming up. You're going to be in Europe. Tell our listeners about that.
Yeah, I'm going in a couple of weeks, going to Denmark for a concert, and I'm going to Switzerland again. I haven't performed there since I was a kid. So that'll be something interesting for me. And I'll be accompanied by an orchestra there and also a children's choir. It's going to be kind of a pretty big deal. And then I'm doing a full-scale album in 3 days, all live in Berlin. This opportunity kind of came my way. It's kind of a side project, but maybe it'll become a lot more than that with, are you ready? Songs by Lou Reed, The Cure, Tracy Chapman, Ron Sexsmith, my band. It's interesting. They want to see what it's like for me at this age and this time in my life. Almost, not that I'm as huge as he was, for sure, but when Johnny Cash did that with 9 Inch Nails.
Yes.
Anyway, they want to see what that's like. And I'm open.
Yeah.
I'll try it and see what happens. It's either going to be really good or it'll be really bad, and you'll never hear it. So we'll see.
I think it would be really good. You could probably melt a whole town down if you started singing Leonard Cohen.
Oh, but honestly, George, who does it better than Jennifer Warnes?
Yeah, she's pretty great.
Right? She's pretty great. She really is. He was a friend of mine.
He was? Okay.
We toured together, and then he came up when I was on stage in New York and sang Bird on a Wire. But we would meet in LA like once a month, and he would bring my apartment, and he'd be waiting on the street corner, and we'd go and have juice smoothies once a month. And I enjoyed my friendship with him very, very much. Really great guy.
That whole era of singer-songwriter troubadours was fascinating.
Yeah. And it was interesting to be in that world and to perform, and on the way out, see the next band coming in. And there was a lot of camaraderie and a lot of drugs that I didn't partake in. So I was a little out of it. I wasn't a partier like everyone else.
Yeah.
I'm from Switzerland, and I was really naive. And all of a sudden, I had this deal, and I don't know what I was doing. But it was an interesting time.
And you're going to be in Los Angeles on November the 2nd.
And then on November 2nd, in LA, George, there aren't really any great theaters. I was at Carnegie Hall 3 times. That's a beautiful theater, as you know, and legendary. But in LA, there's the Troubadour, which I was at. But this one is called the El Rey Theater. And it's just a beautiful, historic.
Yeah, it gets a lot of great acts coming through there.
And it's like an old deco building, and it's a seated audience. And so it's going to be a small group on stage, but I have a wonderful violinist and a cellist from Austria, a New York-based piano player who's going to do those jazz songs that I can't play, and also David Pilch on upright bass, and me.
So you can see Lori Lieberman November 2nd at the El Rey in Los Angeles. Lori, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. I'm just absolutely thrilled. And it's lovely to talk to you and your audience. And thanks so much for thinking of me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 22,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.4 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with guest research by Shelby Hockenberry. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another Apple Doesn't Fall Too Far from the Family Tree edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.